The grave of the winter waste. Everyone in the Urals whispered about it, a remote stretch of forest where the trees didn't grow straight. The wind whispered like voices just behind your ears, and the snow melted into the grayish soil without reason. They called it the winter waste, but most people avoided saying the name out loud. Some said it was cursed, others said it was radioactive, but no one thought it was real until the bodies were found. Ivan Petrov was a geologist from Yekaterinburg, a city more accustomed to ordinary industrial problems than paranormal lore. 35, married, with a 5-year-old daughter, he lived a normal life studying mineral compositions in the Ural Mountains. He had heard local rumors about the winter waste near the tiny settlement of Ozyorsk, a region long associated with nuclear secrets and atomic waste buried deep in the earth. People spoke of old Soviet dumps, glowing ponds, and strange sicknesses, but as a man of science, Ivan dismissed them as folklore. Then one winter, a government research team asked him to join a field mission deep into the forest. They were mapping contamination from an old Soviet dumping site, a place called Lake Karachay, where radioactive waste from the Mayak facility had once been casually disposed of in open water, creating contamination levels comparable to some of the worst nuclear disasters in history. Ivan agreed to go, not because he believed the rumors, but because he trusted data, instruments, readings, controlled variables. He planned to collect soil and water samples, run them through spectrometers back in the lab, and dismiss the local myths once and for all. But as they drove deeper into the Ural forest in a state-issue military truck, something about the atmosphere turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with the Arctic snow. The trees no longer stood upright. They seemed to lean, patiently waiting. By the time they reached the perimeter, a rusted sign read, do not enter, life-threatening hazard. The official maps showed a clearing where the old trenches and pits were, but when Ivan stepped out of the truck, the map dissolved into memory alone. The forest seemed denser than expected, the path narrower, and the snow eerily silent. They set up camp within sight of the old dumping ground. The wind was still. Ivan noticed that his Geiger counter barely ticked, not because there wasn't radiation, but because the instruments themselves seemed tired. It was like the forest had absorbed the readings and exhaled them back in unnatural patterns. He chalked it up to instrument lag and prepped his sampling gear. The first night was quiet, too quiet. The forest seemed to breathe in the darkness. The countdown of his tent's propane heater was the only regular sound. That's when he first heard it, a low whisper on the wind, almost like voices speaking a language just slightly slower than Russian, impossible to understand yet hauntingly familiar. He stepped out of his sleeping bag to look, but saw only the gray silhouettes of trees. In the morning, the lead researcher, Dr. Kuznetsov, noticed something odd in the snow near their equipment. Footprints, not from their group, larger, deeper, and arranged in patterns that looked almost human, then not. They formed circles around the equipment like someone had crouched and watched them sleep. Kuznetsov refused to talk about them, pretending it was animal prints distorted by melting snow. But Ivan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He began waking up before dawn, sweating beneath his thermal quilt, the whispering echoes returning louder, like a chant rising through the forest. By the third day, their instruments began behaving erratically. Cameras malfunctioned, clocks ran backward, tape recordings captured strange static that, when slowed down, sounded unnervingly like breathing, footsteps, and distant voices speaking their names. Ivan, Kuznetsov, the forest seemed to know them. Ivan started experiencing vivid dreams, or were they hallucinations? In the dreams, he walked through a charred landscape where the snow turned gray, the soil fissured like dry skin. In every dream, in the same far distance, there was a woman in old Soviet work clothes, her expression hollow, her eyes looking beyond him into something ancient and unblinking. The fourth night, half his team disappeared. Kuznetsov was the first to notice. The truck was gone, the footprints leading away from camp into the deep forest. No struggle, no sign of panic, just empty equipment and a trail that seemed to vanish inside itself, as though the forest had swallowed the path. Ivan called out. He retraced the steps, following the tracks under the low Ural moon. Snow crunched under his boots as the whispering voices grew louder, now more articulate, beckoning him onward. They sounded close, surrounding him. Then he saw the lights faint, flickering like fireflies in a shape no machine should emit. As he drew near, they resolved into old workshop lanterns half buried in snow, their energy inexplicably buzzing, glowing with a sickly green pulse that seemed to warp the very air. The Geiger counter went berserk, numbers spiking beyond scale. Then he saw them, the bodies of his colleagues. Pale, frozen, faces locked in expressions of terror, lying in impossible positions. No wounds, no signs of struggle, just stillness. Their skin had an odd sheen, and when Ivan knelt, he felt a warmth, something that shouldn't be there in the midst of sudden winter cold. He tried to call out to them, but even his voice sounded distant, muted by the oppressive silence around him. Something brushed against his shoulder. He whipped around, nothing. Just the tall, silent trees, their branches forming a cathedral of frozen spires. But the air had weight, presence, like innumerable unseen eyes watching. He fled back toward what he thought was camp, but the forest refused to be navigated twice the same way. The trees moved, or he did. He couldn't tell. Hours passed in circles before he found the clearing again, but the camp was gone. The trucks, the equipment, the supplies all vanished without trace. Only footprints remained, his own, and others that followed, deeper into the trees. They led him toward a half-buried concrete bunker entrance with a rusted sign barely legible under decades of grime. Laboratory B, authorized personnel only. The building was real, a forgotten remnant of early Soviet nuclear research near Chelyabinsk Oblast, long abandoned and left to rot since the 1950s. Inside, the air was stale, decades of untouched decay. Old machines lay dormant, chalkboards still covered in equations long irrelevant. Paper fragments littered the floor like fallen autumn leaves. But deeper into the bunker, he found something unlikely, a small room with a single light still flickering. Its hum oddly steady in the stagnant air. A recorder sat on a table. Ivan pressed play. Static at first, then whispering voices layered on top of each other, unintelligible at first, until one clear voice emerged, slow, deliberate, saying, We are here, and you will be here too. The tape clicked off. Then silence. Ivan spun around as an explosion of wind surged through the bunker, extinguishing the lone light. In the pitch black, something breathed near him, something alive, something that shouldn't exist. He ran. Hours later, stumbling through the forest in snow and fog, Ivan reached the edge of the winter waste. The trees thinned. Sunlight, pale and weak, broke through the gray sky. But as he looked back, he swore he saw shadows receding into the tree line, watching him go. When he finally made it back to civilization, weak, delirious, and half-frozen, he told his story to anyone who would listen. Scientists dismissed it as stress and radiation sickness. The military denied any interest in the region. But Ivan knew what he saw. He knew what spoke his name in the dark. He knew the winter waste was real, and that whatever was left behind wasn't simply contaminated, it was watching. Now, maps label it restricted forest area, and warnings line the road at its edge. Locals avoid the region entirely, whispering that sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howls just right, voices rise from the dead snow, whispering names that should have long since been forgotten. Vanishing in the mist, ELKWOD forest. It was early September when Michael Turner, a 32-year-old urban explorer from Portland, Oregon, first heard about the old logging town of Elkwood, Washington. The town had been abandoned for decades, a casualty of the logging industry's collapse in the 1970s. What drew Michael, and what he later admitted should have warned him, were the rumors. Elkwood wasn't just empty, it was haunted. Hikers in the nearby Gifford-Pinchot National Forest told stories of strange lights, fleeting shadows, and a sense of being watched. Michael's obsession with abandoned places was well known among his friends. He had explored shuttered hospitals, derelict schools, and forgotten mills, always documenting the experience. But Elkwood felt different. Even online, he found posts warning that the town seemed to shift. People would enter with friends and leave alone. GPS coordinates failed. Trails disappeared. And yet, he was determined. He convinced his friend Lena Ortiz, a photographer with a taste for eerie architecture, to join him. They drove north from Portland, passing through small towns like Castle Rock and Randall, the roads narrowing as they entered the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. A thick mist clung to the tree line, and the highway signs warned of wildlife crossing. Michael laughed nervously, trying to shake the growing sense of unease. By late afternoon, they parked at the nearest trailhead and hiked several miles toward Elkwood. The forest was dense, with towering Douglas firs and moss hanging like tattered curtains. Birds called, but their songs were muted, swallowed by the dense fog. Michael carried a backpack with 2 flashlights, extra batteries, and his handheld video rig. Lena's camera hung from her neck, ready for shots of decayed buildings and abandoned machinery. As they neared the outskirts of Elkwood, they found the first house. A modest wooden structure, its windows boarded, the paint peeled in long strips. The air smelled damp, earthy, with a faint metallic tang that Lena said reminded her of old blood. Michael filmed carefully, narrating for his camera, noting details of rusted nails, the collapse of the roof, and the way the forest seemed to lean in toward the house, as if it were holding its breath. The town itself was eerily intact, streets lined with homes and storefronts, but no sign of life. Faded street signs bore the names of families that once lived there: Harrison's General Store, Miller & Sons Hardware, Elkwood Elementary. Michael and Lena explored cautiously, stepping over debris and broken furniture. It was quiet, too quiet. The wind whispered through the empty town, rattling loose shutters like dry bones. Around sunset, they reached the old school. Windows were shattered, the playground covered in moss. Lena climbed a short hill to photograph the building from above, while Michael filmed from the front entrance. That's when he first noticed it, a figure in the corner of the yard. At first he thought it was Lena, but she was several meters away, waving to him. The figure, a tall man wearing a dark jacket and jeans, stood motionless, watching. When Michael called out, it vanished. Unease settled in. Michael and Lena decided to move on, exploring the town square. A small diner still had the remnants of dishes on counters, menus faded and curled. They laughed nervously, joking about Elkwood residents who never left. But the air had grown cold, the kind of cold that seems to seep into bones. Night fell quickly. Their flashlights revealed only broken buildings and the thick forest looming behind them. Michael suggested setting up near the town hall, reasoning it would be a safe place to camp. Lena agreed reluctantly. As they gathered supplies and set up their small tent, they began hearing noises, distant knocks, the scraping of metal, and what sounded like whispering. At first they assumed it was wildlife, but then the whispers grew clearer, forming words in hushed, urgent tones. Leave, leave, leave. The voice seemed to come from every direction at once, surrounding them. Michael shone his flashlight toward the tree line but saw nothing. Lena whispered that she felt eyes on her, a prickling along the back of her neck. As the night deepened, their cameras captured more than they expected. Faint silhouettes flitted behind broken windows, shapes that moved too quickly to be human. Michael thought he saw someone standing in the schoolyard, watching silently. Lena reported seeing a figure at the end of the street, then another, closer, then disappearing entirely. They tried to sleep, but the forest pressed in. Strange sounds circled the tent, soft footfalls, dragging noises, whispering voices repeating the same command: leave. Around 3 a.m., Michael awoke to the sound of scraping against the tent. He grabbed his flashlight. Its beam caught a shadow outside, crouching, waiting. When he shone it fully, the figure vanished. Determined to leave at first light, they packed quickly. Michael had marked their route carefully with tape and GPS coordinates, but when they began retracing their steps, the forest seemed wrong. The trail curved differently, trees and boulders had shifted. Landmarks they had passed earlier were gone. Panic set in. They tried to follow the GPS, but it flickered and failed. Hours passed. The forest grew darker, fog thicker, and the temperature dropped sharply. Lena tripped over a root, scraping her arm. Michael pulled her up, insisting they keep moving. Voices whispered from the trees, closer now, almost inside their heads. Shapes moved at the edge of vision, sometimes human-like, sometimes distorted. By late afternoon, they stumbled into the remains of a logging site just outside town. Rusted machinery, half buried in moss, seemed to have been abandoned decades ago, yet it radiated a sense of unease, as if the metal itself remembered violence. Michael's camera caught what Lena swore she saw: a man standing silently among the trees, watching them with an intensity that made her stomach turn. They ran, not daring to look back. Eventually, they found a small dirt road leading back toward Randall. Exhausted, cold, and shaken, they reached their car as dusk settled. Behind them, the forest was silent again, but they knew something had been following. Something had been in Elkwood with them. They never returned. In the weeks that followed, Michael reviewed the footage. Shadows moved in impossible ways. Figures appeared where no one could have been. Whispering voices were captured, faint but clear. "Leave. Don't return. You cannot stay." Lena refused to look at the recordings again. Friends reported she became withdrawn, unable to walk past forests without trembling. Elkwood remains abandoned to this day. Travelers and hikers speak of strange lights flickering in the distance, shadows moving just beyond the tree line, and whispers carried on the wind. GPS coordinates fail, trails disappear, and sometimes those who venture too close never return. So if you hear of an abandoned town in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by dense forest and blanketed in mist, remember Michael and Lena. And remember this, curiosity can be dangerous. Some places do not want to be found, and some forests are alive, watching, waiting. The Winter Waste, SECRETS of the URAL forest. The town of Hollow Creek had always been quiet. Nestled between thick forests and jagged hills, it was the kind of place where people waved to strangers and every face was familiar. But there was a stretch of forest just outside the town, long avoided by anyone who valued their sanity, known simply as the Black Hollow. Locals whispered about it in hushed tones, warning children never to stray too far. They said it was alive, that it watched, that sometimes the forest did not like being intruded upon. Daniel had grown up in Hollow Creek, and like most young men, he thought the stories were just that, stories, folklore to scare children. Yet, something about that forest had always called to him. Perhaps it was the way the fog seemed to cling to the trees even on sunny days, or the strange echo that sometimes answered his own voice when he shouted across the clearing. One crisp autumn morning, he decided he would finally see it for himself. He packed a small bag, a flashlight, a pocket knife, water, and a notebook to record his observations. The edge of the forest was darker than he remembered, shadows pooling unnaturally beneath the trees. The air smelled damp, like wet earth and decaying leaves. The forest seemed almost to breathe, a soft sigh moving through the branches. As he stepped onto the trail, he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a tension that made the hair on his neck stand up. But Daniel was determined. He had always been curious, and curiosity, he thought, was stronger than fear. The first hour was uneventful. The trail wound through pines and oaks, sunlight breaking through gaps in the canopy, casting pale patches of light on the leaf-strewn ground. Birds called overhead, but their songs seemed oddly muted. Every few minutes, Daniel thought he heard something else, a rustle that didn't belong to wind or animals, a footstep behind him that stopped whenever he turned. He told himself it was his imagination. By midday, the forest had grown colder, the sunlight dimmer. The trail forked and Daniel hesitated. One path led deeper into dense woods, the other appeared to circle back toward the river he had crossed an hour ago. He chose the deeper path, reasoning that the farther he went, the more interesting the observations would be. Almost immediately, the temperature seemed to drop. His breath came out in soft, visible clouds. The air felt heavier, pressing against his chest. He thought he heard whispers among the trees, indistinct words carried on the wind, but every time he paused, the sound disappeared. As he walked, he noticed strange markings on the trees, scratches almost like letters carved by hands. They didn't resemble anything he recognized, but the pattern seemed deliberate. Occasionally, he would see something move in the corner of his vision, a shadow slipping between the trunks. Every time he turned, nothing was there. His heartbeat quickened, but he pressed on, rationalizing each occurrence as a trick of the forest, shadows, and light playing games. Hours passed. The trail grew narrower, the trees twisting unnaturally. Daniel realized he had not seen a single animal, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. Only the silence, broken by his own footsteps and the occasional distant cracking of branches. He tried to mark his trail with small piles of stones, but when he looked back, the piles were gone. The path behind him seemed to stretch endlessly, unfamiliar. Panic began to creep in. He realized he had no sense of direction. The forest seemed to shift as he moved, paths bending and turning where none had existed moments ago. By late afternoon, the shadows had lengthened into a dark, oppressive gloom. The whispers returned, louder now, almost articulate, but still just out of comprehension. Daniel stopped and listened, straining to understand. They were calling his name. He spun in circles, flashlight trembling in his hand, but the forest was empty. He began to run, twisting through trees, stumbling over roots and rocks, desperate to find the way out. The sounds of pursuit, or was it just the forest itself, echoed all around him, surrounding him in a cacophony of unseen steps, whispers, and faint laughter. Night fell with alarming suddenness. The forest became pitch black, the beam of his flashlight barely cutting through the dense darkness. Shapes moved just beyond the circle of light, shadows that didn't belong to anything tangible, black forms that seemed to watch and follow him. Daniel's mind screamed at him to stop, to turn back, but every direction looked the same. The trail had disappeared completely. Panic overtook reason. He stumbled into a clearing and froze. The clearing was empty, silent, too silent. And then he saw it, a cabin, small and old, with windows dark and unwelcoming. It had not been there when he started the trail, or had it. He couldn't remember. The air around the cabin was still, unnervingly so. His instincts screamed at him to run, but exhaustion and curiosity compelled him to approach. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, dust lay thick on every surface, and the faint scent of rot and mildew filled his nostrils. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He explored the cabin cautiously. On the walls, he found more of the strange carvings, deeper and more deliberate than the ones in the forest. They seemed to writhe in the shadows, letters shifting when he looked away. He tried to touch them, but his fingers recoiled as if burned by some unseen force. A sudden cold gust slammed the door behind him, plunging him into near darkness. The flashlight flickered and died. He was alone. Or so he thought. Whispers filled the room, circling him, echoing in impossible directions. "Don't leave, stay with us," they said. Shadows moved along the walls, elongating, twisting into shapes that resembled human figures, but with impossible limbs, faces blurred, mouths stretching into silent screams. Panic set in. Daniel backed away, tripping over something. A journal lay on the floor, open to a page filled with scrawled notes. Names, dates. Some of the names were familiar, missing people from Hollow Creek over decades. Others were not. The dates were recent. As he read, a sound behind him made him spin. The doorway was empty, but the air felt heavy, suffocating. The shadows coalesced, forming a mass that seemed alive, writhing in place. It whispered his name over and over, calling him to step forward, to join it. Daniel ran, bursting out of the cabin into the darkness. The forest seemed endless, twisting, reshaping itself with every step. The whispers followed, urgent, mocking, promising release if only he would stop running. Hours or maybe days passed. Time had no meaning. He stumbled into a clearing where the fog was thick, so dense that he could barely see his hands in front of his face. Shapes moved in the fog, circling him, closing in. Every attempt to flee led him back to the same cabin, standing silent, patient, waiting. Exhaustion and terror blurred his thoughts. He could feel them now, whatever lived in the black hollow, watching, waiting, tethered to the forest, connected to him. Finally, he collapsed by the base of a massive oak. The whispers became almost tangible, brushing against his ears like cold breath. He tried to speak, to cry out, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The shadows began to extend, fingers of darkness reaching for him, enveloping him, pulling him toward the cabin once more. He struggled, clawing at roots, at earth, at air, but it was futile. The forest was alive, and it had decided. Some say Daniel never left the Black Hollow. Hikers report glimpses of a figure wandering aimlessly in the mist, sometimes carrying a flashlight, sometimes not. They say he looks lost, muttering to himself, or perhaps to something else. The cabin is still there, sometimes visible, sometimes not, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble into the forest. And the forest itself sighs in the wind, whispering in voices just beyond comprehension, promising that those who enter are rarely allowed to leave. Tonight, as you lie down to sleep, remember this: some places are not meant to be found, some paths are not meant to be walked, and some forests are alive. They watch, they wait, they remember. So if the wind whistles through the trees outside your window, and if shadows seem to move where they shouldn't, remember Daniel, remember the Black Hollow, and remember that curiosity in the wrong place can be fatal. And maybe, just maybe, the forest is listening to you too.